Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Larry Parks Show. I'm Larry Parks, and this is the Extreme Consumer Advocacy Show. We talk about how ordinary people get ripped off by the system. And the system that we've been most concerned about is the monetary system, because it threatens not only your pension, your savings, your annuities, or anything that's been promised to you for future payment. And if you've been watching this show for a while, you know the malfeasance in the monetary system is off the scale, and people's pensions and savings and whatnot are being depreciated as I speak. Tonight, I'm going to do the second part of a three-part series on why the monetary system violates Jewish law. Now, let me just take a few moments to review Jewish law, the particular law that I'm concerned about, and it's called the Genivas Das commandment. Genivas is the verb form of the Hebrew word ganav, which is a thief. Genivas, to steal, and das is your mind, literally to steal your mind, but really to misrepresent. It's forbidden. So let me just run through a little bit about the Genivas Das commandment, and then I'll recap quickly what I covered in the first part, and then I'm going to talk today about misrepresentations, violations of Jewish law on the bills themselves. So let's go to the first slide, please. The Genivas Das commandment is a prohibition against deception. The literal meaning of Genivas Das in Hebrew is theft of one's mind, thoughts, wisdom, or knowledge. That is, fooling someone and thereby causing him or her to have a mistaken assumption, belief, and or impression. Thus, the term is used in Jewish law to indicate deception, cheating, creating a false impression, and acquiring undeserved goodwill. Let's go to the next slide, please. Genivas Das goes beyond lying. Any words or actions that cause others to form incorrect conclusions about one's motives might be a violation of this prohibition. One does not have the right to diminish the ability of another person, Jew or Gentile, to make a fair and honest evaluation, whether in business or interpersonal relations. And let's go to the next slide, please. This prescription of Genivas Das is included in the transgression, you shall not steal. It's really a subset of one of the 10 commandments, and Torah explicitly states that you should distance yourself from false matter. Come back to me, please. Now, this is a very serious commandment. It's not one of those things like keeping kosher where you can get forgiven and whatnot at Yom Kippur by throwing a rock on the stone and asking forgiveness. This is almost a capital offense. Now, let's go to the next slide, please. So the sages believed that there are 7 types of thieves, and the most egregious is the one who steals the minds of the people. In other words, misrepresenting to ordinary people. And finally, the next slide, please. Again, this is not a minor prohibition. One of the sages, one of the old Rebbe scholars, says that Absalom, the son of King David, deserved death for violating the Torah law against Genivas Das. These references come to me from Hershey Friedman, who's a professor of business and marketing department at economics at Brooklyn College, and he put this up on an essay in a terrific piece of research that he did. Come back to me, please. Now, what I did in the last session is I showed what the founders had said about paper money, and I had quotes from people like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, where they all were against and spoke very vehemently against paper money. And then I showed images of the money that we use today that has their pictures on the paper money, as if they would give their imprimatur to the paper money when in fact they opposed it. And in fact, at the Constitutional Convention, when it came up whether to allow the government to issue paper money, it was voted on and rejected. So that was the session of my first part of this violation of Jewish law. Today I'm going to talk about violations on the bills themselves. And as a segue, I want to just do a little bit more on what I did in the first time, and I want to talk a little bit about Salmon Chase. Salmon Chase was Lincoln's Treasury Secretary during the Civil War, and he issued legal tender notes to help finance the Civil War. Legal tender is something that Thomas Jefferson, you recall, said we didn't have. Thomas Paine said that people should be sentenced to death for proposing legal tender. Now let's go to the next slide, please. Now here is a quote from Salmon Chase when he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he wrote this in the Knox versus Lee decision, and he says, "The legal tender quality of money is valuable only for the purpose of dishonesty." Come back to me, please. So here you have the sitting Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court telling you that whenever you see legal tender on a bill, it's necessary only for the purpose of dishonesty. Let's go to the next slide, please. And here you see a Federal Reserve note. It's got Salmon Chase's picture on it, and this is a legal tender note. This is an image of a $10,000 bill. Now, in the left-hand side, you see that A, and there's some little writing above it. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is what that writing says. It says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury at any Federal Reserve Bank. So here you have, come back to me. So here you have on the paper money a picture of the sitting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who said the whole thing is necessary only for dishonesty, and here they have the effrontery to misrepresent to the people in violation of law, Jewish law that is, that Salmon Chase might have approved this when in fact he condemned it in no uncertain terms. And now we come to tonight's topic. I want to talk about misrepresentations on the bills themselves. Let's go to the next slide, please. We have in the United States this notion that we have what they call the rule of law. And the notion is in order to achieve more certainty in personal relationships, people enter agreements, contracts, which are governed in an area of law called contract law. The concept is that the courts will uphold legal contracts not fraudulently entered into by consenting adults. Go to the next slide, please. Actually, one slide after that. One more. There we go. A vital subset of contract law deals with promises to pay. In the most elemental form, promises to pay are called promissory notes, also known as notes. Now go to the next slide, please. Now, for a promissory note to be legally valid, it has to have 4 elements. Come back to me, please. These 4 elements used to be on the Federal Reserve notes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what the 4 elements are on the original Federal Reserve notes, and I'm going to show you how this stuff got taken off. So in effect, the misrepresentation is to call the money that we have now notes. They are not notes. Come back to that exact same slide. Do not go ahead that we were at. Okay? So for a promissory note to be legally valid, it has to have 4 elements. First, it has a maker, a person or an entity who's going to make the payment. Go to the next slide, please. And then it needs a payee, somebody who's going to receive the payment. Go to the next slide, please. And then it has to have an amount to be paid. And finally, go to the next slide, please, a date certain when the payment is due. Now go to the next slide, please. Now here's a $20 Federal Reserve note. And at the top, it says Federal Reserve note. You have to go 1 slide back. You went ahead too far. There we go. At the top, it says Federal Reserve note. The maker is the Federal Reserve. The 20, it's a $20 bill. So we have the maker and we have the amount of the note. Go to the next slide, please. And at the bottom, I've blown it up so you can see what it says. It says we'll pay to the bearer on demand. The bearer is the payee, and on demand is the due date. So now we have the 4 elements that make this a legal promissory note. We have a maker, the Federal Reserve. We have the amount of the note, which is the $20. We have the payee, which is the bearer. And we have the time when it's due. And go to the next slide, please. And here is what these Federal Reserve notes look like today. And it no longer says we'll pay to the bearer on demand. That no longer appears on the bill. Come back to me, please. So, by calling the money that we have today notes, this is a misrepresentation. And really what they did is they snuck this in. This is not something that people voted on. People aren't even mindful of it. It looks like the old Federal Reserve notes. And the fact that the important wording, will pay to the bearer on demand, that's all missing. And the reasons it's missing is because they don't have anything to pay to the bearer on demand. And in effect, they have deceived people. This is a violation of the commandment Genevas das. In other words, it's a trick. Now go to the next slide, please. Let's see what Webster's Dictionary has to say about what constitutes fraud. And this is right out of the 9th edition of the Collegiate Dictionary. It says, fraud is deceit or trickery, an intentional perversion of truth in order to induce another to part with something of value or to surrender a legal right, an act of deceiving or misrepresenting, a trick, one who is not what he pretends to be. In other words, the bill that says a Federal Reserve note, it's not what it intends to be, cheat. One is not what it seems or is represented to be. Go to the next slide, please. So Federal Reserve notes are not notes. So what are they? They're pieces of paper with ink on them. They're paper tickets or tokens. And now I ask the question, well, what does it matter? Come back to me, please. So people have this notion of money. You know, you work all week, you get paid at the end of the week, you take the money to the grocery, whatever, you buy what you need. What's the difference whether it's a real note or not a note? I mean, who cares? And the answer is there's a second function of money. We don't use money to buy the stuff that we need this week. We also use money to provide for future payment, for our pensions, for annuities, for savings, for a rainy day, for college education for our kids. There's a very well-known story in China before they had their runaway inflation in 1946 to 1949, which brought the communists to power, by the way, more than anything else. So Chinese people are very education conscious. And so a lot of times, Chinese families would set aside money every week in order to accumulate enough savings so that when their children go to school, they would have the money. And so there's a story about this one family. They saved and saved from the time the kid was born, and by the time the kid came time to go to college, the purchasing power of the money had depreciated so much, they took all of it and bought him a birthday cake. So in other words, the savings of a lifetime that were accumulated for a particular purpose, when the time came to use it for that purpose, it was worthless. So in fact, these Federal Reserve notes, they're not notes, these so-called Federal Reserve notes that we have as money today, they're really just tokens. And so the question comes up, well, a lot of times tokens are better than money, better than money. Now let's go to the next slide, please. So one example of a token that's better than money is the Metro card. And we use these Metro cards to buy fares for the subway, for the buses and whatnot. And the reason it's better than money is because you don't have to fundle around to find it to make the payment. You can put, I don't know, $40, $50, $60, $80 on a Metro card. It's convenient, fits in your wallet. But who in their right mind would take Metro cards for their pension? So in other words, the fact that these Federal Reserve notes, come back to me please, the fact that these Federal Reserve notes can be easily used for day-to-day purchases is besides the point. Who cares about that? What's important to people in terms of money is to be able to provide for future payment, for when you cannot work. The labor people have a song for this. It's called Too Old to Work, Too Young to Die, How Am I Going to Get By? And the answer is you save. But if it turns out that when it comes time to utilize your savings that it doesn't buy anything, well, what's the point of savings? And in America, since the money has been depreciating greatly over the last 30, 40 years, the savings rate has gone down close to zero. And so people are not saving. Why save a depreciating asset? In effect, most people, ordinary people, are depending in large part on their Social Security, on pensions that have been promised to them by employers. And in fact, what's happening very rapidly now is that the purchasing power of the Social Security money is evaporating. Oh, I know, you think that the Social Security is somehow key to the Consumer Price Index. Well, those of you who have been watching this show before, you know that the Consumer Price Index has been manipulated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and that the methodology for computing it has been changed 4 times since the Clinton years. So as a result of violating Jewish law, by misrepresenting to people on the nature of their money, in effect, we're cheating people out of their pensions, out of their Social Security, out of benefits for disabled veterans, and anything that's been promised, such as annuities. Now here's another example of the fraud on our money. Let's come to the next slide, please. This is an image of a $1 silver certificate. Now you can't read the little writing at the bottom. I'm going to blow that up in a second. But what it says, we'll pay to the bearer on demand $1. So right under Washington, there's writing. Now let's go to the next slide, please. And here's what it says. We'll pay to the bearer on demand $1. So this is a promise to pay. Go back to the last slide, please. So this image, this isn't the dollar. This is a promise to pay $1. And of course, in time, this promise was broken. Skip ahead now, another slide, another slide. And this is what the bill looks like now. And now it no longer says a promise to pay $1. Come back to me, please. So now the broken promise, come back to me, please. So now the broken promise to pay $1 has become $1. That's stupid. I mean, how stupid can stupid be? And how come people don't notice this? And the answer is we've been misrepresented to. We've been tricked. And this is the indicia of a fraud. And again, this violates the Genevas das commandment in Jewish law not to misrepresent, not to fool the people. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, I've spoken now in the last session about misrepresenting the strongly held views of the founders on the paper money, and I've just spoken a little bit about misrepresentations on the paper money itself, and now I want to talk about misrepresenting the provisions of the Constitution. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here's the question I want to address now. What powers does the Constitution grant the government, and what does it not grant the government with regard to money? Come back to me, please. Now, when the founders met at the Constitutional Convention, they were not supposed to write a constitution. They were supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation allowed the government to what they call emit bills of credit. In other words, in those days, it meant to print money. The founders had had a very bad experience with the paper money, and if you watch the first part of this show, you know what that experience was. People like Jefferson got cheated out of the inheritance that his wife inherited. In fact, he was in debt his entire life. At the end, he was bankrupt, and they had to auction off his belongings at Monticello in order to help pay his debts, which were not sufficient to pay his debts. People like James Madison, another founder, had leased his land prior to the Revolution, and the people to whom he leased it paid it off in paper money, which was depreciated. George Washington remarked that it would take a wagon load of money to buy a wagon load of provisions. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, called the paper money a cheat. Alexander Hamilton warned against paper money. And so when they got to the Constitutional Convention, and they voted on this, they voted down the notion of issuing paper money. And here's what they wrote in Article 1, Section 8. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this is right out of the Constitution. So here they give the federal government the power to coin money, to regulate the value thereof, and I want to talk about that in a moment, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. That is the only power given to the general government in connection with money. Come back to me, please. So you see, they gave them the power to coin money. Now, what does that mean, to regulate the value thereof? Well, regulate in those days, if you look in the dictionaries of the time, and Dr. Edwin Vieira, who wrote the magnificent Pieces of Eight, the Monetary Powers and Disabilities of the Constitution, what regulate meant was to fix. And the value is not the purchasing power. The value is the precious metal content in the coins. In other words, what that amendment, what that provision in the Constitution means, Article 1, Section 8, to fix the value, is to say how much silver a coin had, how much gold a coin had. This is not to say that they could change the value of a dollar. The word dollar is mentioned twice in the Constitution, once in connection with the slave tax, which went away, but also, very importantly, in connection with the Seventh Amendment, which guarantees a trial by jury for any dispute $20 or more. Now, if it were true that the Congress could make the dollar anything the Congress wanted it to make it, add metal, subtract metal, make it a piece of paper or whatnot, that would mean that the Congress could rewrite the Seventh Amendment at will. That is absurd. And so the dollar had to mean a particular thing. And what it meant was the Spanish mill dollar. And again, if you've been watching this program, you know that whole story. And when Hamilton wrote the Coinage Act of 1792, here he defined the dollar as 371.25 grains of silver. Where did he get that crazy number from? Well, that's what the Spanish mill dollar weighed, and that is the dollar that's mentioned in the Constitution. That has nothing to do with this notion of regulating the value of the metal content of coins. That just fixed what a dollar is. And today, the dollar is totally misrepresented to us, another violation of the Genevas das commandment. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, in addition to the powers given to the federal government, Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, states that no state shall coin money. So in other words, the states were not allowed to issue money, emit bills of credit. A bill of credit was the paper money, or make anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debts. Come back to me, please. Now, when they talk about a tender in payment of debts, they're talking about legal tender. And legal tender for gold and silver is redundant because people accept it anyway. But the notion is that whenever the states pay money, they're supposed to pay in gold and silver. Now, do you see the states paying anything in gold and silver today? So in effect, these people are violating the Constitution right and left. They're violating the Constitution in connection with how they create money. They're violating the Constitution in what the states do. And of course, we have paper money, which again was not, they were not empowered to do that. And in fact, everybody condemned it. Now let's go to the next slide, please. And this is from the 10th Amendment. It says, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Come back to me, please. So the notion when the founders made the Constitution is that we would have a limited government. Why is it important to have a limited government? And the reason is, by definition, doesn't matter what kind of government you have, whether it's a tyrant, totalitarian, communist, socialist, free society, whatnot, one of the main defining features of government is that government has the monopoly on the legal use of force. Nobody else in society is allowed to use force. There is a minor exception for self-defense. However, that is highly prescribed, as Bernie Goetz found out. And in no event is anybody allowed to defend themselves against government, as our fellow citizens at Waco found out. So in effect, since government has the monopoly on the legal use of force, how do you protect the people that somehow some politician who's, how shall I say, overambitious, greedy, or whatever, is not going to use this legal power, legal monopoly on the use of force in order to oppress the people? And the only way to do that is to limit what he's allowed to do. And the limiting factor is the Constitution. That is our safeguard against runaway government. So government has the power of coercion, but government also has the power of the purse. These are two powers that really define government. And the power of the purse, in order for governments to spend money, they should have to tax it. If they can create it out of nothing or themselves, or have easy access to money created out of nothing by someone else, in effect, they don't have to come to the people, and you're not represented. So this is the case in a lot of countries that get foreign aid from the United States. Say Egypt, for example. Egypt has an oppressive government. However, they don't have to answer to the people. They get $3 billion a year from the American government. So this notion of limiting the government is very important, and one of the ways to limit the government is to see that the government does not have easy access to money created out of nothing. Now let's go to the last slide, please. So this slide shows the progression of how our, that's not it. Next slide. Next slide, please. One more slide, folks. We having trouble there? There we go. So this slide shows the progression of how we went from an honest monetary structure to where we are today. So we started off, the constitutional money is gold and silver is money, and then in exchange for the gold and silver, they gave us promissory notes, also known as notes that were redeemable in gold and silver. And finally, they forgot about the redemption, and now we have irredeemable paper ticket electronic money. Come back to me, please. All of this was done with trickery. This was no one came to ordinary people. No vote was taken on this. This was all done by lobbyists bribing our so-called, I should say, elected representatives to get them to, in effect, delegate to the banking system in the United States a power that the government does not have under our Constitution, the power to create money out of nothing. And the way they got to do this is they fooled everybody. They did it slowly. It wasn't done in one shot. It's not like they went from gold and silver to paper money. Nobody would have accepted that, say, in 1820 or 1830. People like Daniel Webster were giving speeches that nothing deceives the working man more than paper money. Everybody knew about the perils of paper money. They had a saying about the paper money of the Revolution. It was called Continentals. And so the saying was not worth a Continental. The hyperinflation in France with the assignats after the Revolution was in everybody's mind. Everybody knew about the perils of paper money. Here in America today, people are not mindful of this. And the authorities have done the very best they can to obfuscate, to disguise, to lure people into thinking that the paper money is somehow modern, that it's somehow it's okay to have your retirement denominated in a 401k plan, all denominated in irredeemable paper tickets. Now, what is the big problem for you right now today, and how can you best protect yourself with this? The real problem, again, which is not discussed in the press at all, it's not the subprime mortgage breakdown. It's not the fact that these collateralized debt originations are overstated, maybe to the tune of a couple of trillion. It's not that private pension plans are underfunded $500 billion, or that public pension plans are underfunded $1.5 trillion. The problem is the derivatives. And today there's something north of $400 trillion worth, trillion with a T. This is a tip-off for you folks that there's something wrong here, because this is a number range that was reserved for astronomy, not for finance. And this $400+ trillion worth of derivatives, the de facto counterparty is the so-called lender of last resort at the Federal Reserve and the other central banks around the world. And they are prepared and will create money without limit. These are Alan Greenspan's words, without limit, should something go wrong. And will something go wrong? Absolutely. And how do you know? Because there is no longer any market-based self-correcting mechanism on increasing financial leverage. It just keeps increasing. And any scientist or engineer can tell you that any system that doesn't have a self-correcting mechanism blows up, and this one's going to blow up too. So the best way to protect yourself, it turns out, is with gold. And that's one of the reasons why they've denigrated gold, and we've done shows on that. We're going to do more, is because this really threatens the revenue stream, the fees that the professional money managers get today, roughly $500 billion a year worldwide, and another $500 billion a year worldwide to the banks for creating the money out of nothing. Well, this concludes my presentation tonight about the misrepresentations and fraud on the money itself, and why it violates Jewish law, particularly the Genevas Das, not to steal people's minds, not to misrepresent. I want to thank everybody for watching the show. It's a real pleasure and honor to present to you, and I hope you'll tune in again next week for the last segment on why the monetary system violates Jewish law. Good night, and let's end, folks, with the last slide, please. That's not the last slide, Gloria. There we go. So fame depends on your contributions. This is a 501c3 public charity. Nobody gets any salaries for doing this, but we do have expenses. And if you think you've benefited from these presentations, we ask that you please consider a small contribution and mail it to the post office box above. Thanks so much, folks, and God bless, and good night.